So this project was born out of really two very straightforward observations. The first observation was that when we look across domains, whether it be organizational, educational, political, one of the most popular approaches or mindsets that individuals and these institutions have taken towards managing or improving issues of racial equality has been to endorse colorblindness. This notion that racial differences do not matter, and they're sort of all the same. The second observation was that we really don't know too much about the effectiveness of this strategy. There's been some research done looking at this, but there hasn't really been a direct test of any indicator of whether or not this approach is effective in taking us closer to a more equitable society. So we sought to begin to answer this question, and to do so, we explored the question of the effectiveness of colorblindness within the domain of education. The reason being is, from rhetoric at the level of national education reform to the individual behaviors of teachers saying we're all the same, race doesn't matter in a classroom, to even the tendencies among 10-year-old children to not want to say references to skin color. Colorblindness was everywhere, and we thought that this would be a ripe domain and context to explore the impact or the implications of this strategy. So to do so, we entered to a series of elementary schools and asked children between 8 and 11 years old to review a multimedia storybook. And the storybook had two different versions. They were almost identical. Both described the third grade teacher's efforts to champion racial equality in her class, but the specific approach to doing so was slightly different in each of these two versions. There was a colorblind version that described the need to not talk or pay attention to racial differences as the means to this end of furthering racial equality. And the second one, a value diversity condition, really talked about the polar opposite strategy, which is thinking about accentuating and celebrating these differences, and this being the correct means to the end. And what we did is we asked children to review these and sort of primed them or got them to think in this mindset. And then subsequently, we presented them with 3 different incidents that we told them had occurred at a previous elementary school. These incidents depicted varying levels of racial bias. So in one incident, for example, a black child was not invited to a white child's birthday party. That perhaps was ambiguous evidence. There could be other reasons. In some of the most severe ones, there was actually a physical assault in a soccer game, aggression against a black child, and it was clear that it was motivated by race from the story. So a scope of severity in these instances. After listening to these instances, we asked children to describe the instances back to us, listening to the way that they had processed this and thought about this information. And then we asked them to make assessments as to whether or not they thought each of these 3 incidents depicted racial discrimination.
Our key variable of interest was the percent of students who detected discrimination in each of the incidents. When exposed to a value diversity mindset, 3% of the students detected discrimination in the control condition, 43% of the students detected discrimination when there was ambiguous evidence of bias, and 77% of the students detected discrimination when there was explicit evidence of bias. Importantly, these frequencies were consistent with a set of ratings obtained from students not exposed to any storybook, suggesting that the value diversity mindset is not simply making students hypersensitive to racial bias. When placed in a colorblind mindset, however, a different pattern of results emerged. Those who were in the control condition, no one detected discrimination, as would be expected. However, the results for the other 2 conditions were quite different. The percentages dropped quite significantly. Only 10% of the students detected discrimination when there was ambiguous evidence of bias, and only 50% of the students detected discrimination when there was explicit evidence of bias. These results are striking. They suggest that exposure to a colorblind mindset can actually reduce individuals' sensitivity to meaningful racial differences. So children who have a colorblind mindset and are exposed to racial discrimination are often going to fail to see it as such. We also wondered whether this diminished sensitivity when placed in a colorblind mindset could change the way in which children report these incidents, and as a result, whether an adult actually decides to intervene. As described previously, children recounted each of the incidents back to us, and their descriptions were video recorded. We then took these descriptions and we showed them to school teachers, and had the school teachers rate how serious they thought the incident was and the extent to which they thought an adult intervention was necessary. We found that the students who were initially primed with a colorblind mindset described the incidents in such a way that was less likely to lead to adult intervention, as opposed to students who were in the value diversity mindset. Teachers were less likely to see the need for intervention because the student's description played down the race-related nature of each of the transgressions. In a real-world situation, we could see that bullying that was based on race could actually go unnoticed by onlookers and could be seen as just regular old everyday bullying by teachers because they're given insufficient information to determine that it was actually discrimination. In sum, our results show that despite good intentions to try to promote egalitarianism through colorblindness, it can actually backfire and result in quite the opposite. This can permit even explicit forms of bias to go unnoticed and unaddressed. Perhaps most alarming, on the surface, colorblindness actually appears to work. We see the reported incidence of bias go down. However, our study suggests that colorblindness may actually just create a false impression of progress. It may not actually reduce bias as much as it changes the lens through which such bias is perceived.